Hello, I'm Janet McCabe, Acting Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. I'm truly excited that everyone watching this wants to be part of the conversation about reducing carbon pollution from existing power plants under President Obama's Climate Action Plan. At EPA, our job is to protect American families from harmful pollution. That's been our mission for more than 40 years, and in the air program, we've seen tremendous success in cleaning up the air we breathe and improving public health. Protecting our air quality has been a partnership effort between federal, state, local, and tribal governments since the passage of the Clean Air Act. Through the adoption and implementation of standards, emission reduction plans, and voluntary programs, and through the invention and adoption of innovative, increasingly cleaner technologies by American businesses, we've worked together to reduce air pollution in our cities, towns, and rural areas, improving public health and quality of life all across the country. At the same time, we know that carbon pollution, through its contribution to global climate change, presents a significant threat to Americans' health and to the environment upon which our economy and national security depends. And so now, as we turn our attention to reducing carbon pollution from the existing fleet of power plants, we want to build on the foundation these partnerships have built. Our successes could not have been achieved without partnerships with states, with industry and labor leaders, with tribes, with environmental and public health organizations, and with the public. All of these partners matter, and their perspectives and ideas have helped to develop common sense, workable, and cost-effective solutions to reducing harmful pollution. President Obama's Climate Action Plan calls for EPA to continue this momentum into the future through a number of actions, and addressing emissions from power plants is an important element of the plan. We know that the states have already made important progress. For example, more than 20 states have already set greenhouse gas reduction targets. More than 35 have set renewable energy targets or goals of some kind. Local governments are making important progress too. Over 1,000 mayors have signed agreements to cut carbon pollution, and there are creative programs in cities and towns across the country to reduce energy use. There is energy, and I use that term knowingly, all across the country to provide for our energy needs in cleaner, smarter ways that will provide jobs and reliable, affordable power. The President's plan calls for EPA to build on this leadership. The overview presentation you're about to see lays the basic groundwork for the conversation we are now beginning about the steps we will take to address carbon emissions from power plants. Through this outreach process, we're engaging with a broad range of stakeholders, so we consider the broadest range of ideas about how this program can work. In addition, we want to know about new ideas, not just what has worked, but what could work in states, companies, and communities across the nation. Together, we can think creatively about the challenge at hand, and we can craft common-sense solutions to help move us toward a cleaner energy future. This is especially important here because, as you will hear in this webinar, the Clean Air Act gives states the responsibility to develop their own plans to meet the carbon reduction standard that EPA's rules will set. Today, we'll walk you through the basics of the part of the Clean Air Act that can reduce carbon pollution from power plants, Section 111. Through this webinar, we hope to build a common understanding about how Section 111 has worked, about how it gives us room to be creative, innovative, and flexible as we think about how to design a cost-effective program to reduce carbon pollution from existing power plants, and about the key role that states have in designing state plans that fit their needs while meeting national goals to reduce carbon emissions. Then this coming fall, we will turn our focus to building on this understanding, gathering ideas, and looking at solutions together. And before I turn it over to Lisa Connor from our Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards to walk you through our presentation, I want to thank you once again for joining us, and I look forward to hearing from and working with you on this most important public health issue.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm glad you've joined us to learn more about reducing carbon pollution from power plants as part of the President's Climate Action Plan. This overview presentation is the first step in EPA's efforts to reach out and talk with people about a variety of perspectives. Our goal is to help build a common understanding around the Clean Air Act and upcoming carbon pollution guidelines for existing power plants. Over the coming weeks and months, we will have the chance to continue these discussions with many of you. In the following slides, I'll walk you through some background on carbon pollution and the impacts on climate and health, the President's Climate Action Plan, and how the Clean Air Act has a role in that plan. Then I'll present a basic overview of Section 111 of the Clean Air Act and describe how it has worked. I'll touch on new and existing sources and some of the provisions in the Clean Air Act that are relevant to this discussion. Then I'll introduce my colleague, Dr. Bob Wayland, to talk about the electric power sector and some of the opportunities there are to build on state leadership. Finally, I'll discuss how Section 111 gives us room to be creative, innovative, and flexible as we think about how to design a program to reduce carbon pollution from existing power plants. First, let me provide a brief background on carbon pollution and health. In December 2009, EPA's administrator released an endangerment finding that the current and projected concentrations of 6 key greenhouse gases in the atmosphere threaten the public health and the welfare of current and future generations. These 6 greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, also known as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. These pollutants, if left unchecked, lead to long-lasting changes in our climate, such as rising global temperatures. They've risen 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 100 years. In fact, 8 of the 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2001. Rising sea level, which can increase the risk of storm surge and flooding along our coasts. Changes in weather and precipitation that can lead to changes in ecosystems, habitats, and species diversity. These changes threaten America's health and welfare for current and future generations. Public health risks include more heat waves and drought, worsening smog, also called ground-level ozone pollution, increasing the intensity of extreme events like hurricanes, extreme precipitation, and flooding, increasing the geographic range of ticks and mosquitoes, which can spread disease such as Lyme disease and West Nile virus. Our most vulnerable citizens, including children, older adults, people with heart and lung disease, and people living in poverty, may be most at risk from the health impacts of climate change. Of the 6 key greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide accounts for 84% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in 2011. As you can see in the pie chart, about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas pollution in the United States comes from the generation of electricity by power plants. The principal greenhouse gases that enter the atmosphere due to human activities include carbon dioxide, or CO2, which comes from burning fossil fuels, solid waste, trees, and wood products, and from chemical reactions during the manufacture of cement, steel, and aluminum. Methane, or CH4, is from the production and transport of coal, natural gas, and oil, from livestock and other agricultural practices, and from the decay of organic wastes in our landfills. Nitrous oxide, or N2O, results from the combustion of fossil fuels and solid waste, and from agricultural and industrial activities. And then the fluorinated gases are typically emitted in smaller quantities, but are potent greenhouse gases. These synthetic greenhouse gases are emitted from a variety of industrial processes. They are sometimes also used as substitutes for ozone-depleting substances, such as refrigerants. In June of 2013, President Obama announced his Climate Action Plan. This plan reinforced EPA's commitment to cutting harmful pollution, protecting our country from the impacts of climate change, and leading an international effort to address a changing climate. By addressing climate change and by cutting carbon pollution, we will help to keep our air and water clean, spark innovation that drives economic growth and creates good-paying jobs. It will also modernize our power sector using the latest technology to reduce carbon emissions and move our economy towards cleaner, more efficient forms of energy. At EPA, we've been working to cut carbon pollution since 2009. Since that time, we've made significant progress, most notably through stronger fuel economy standards for cars and trucks that will cut billions of tons of carbon pollution, save consumers trillions of dollars, and dramatically reduce our nation's dependence on foreign oil. And the President's plan calls for EPA to continue this momentum by cutting carbon pollution from power plants, building a 21st century transportation sector, and changing the way we use energy by using more clean energy, wasting less energy, and becoming more efficient throughout the economy. By reducing methane and hydrofluorocarbons, preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change, and by leading international efforts to address global climate change. This presentation focuses primarily on reducing carbon pollution from power plants, and the President gave EPA a specific directive on how to move forward toward this goal. President Obama directed EPA to set flexible carbon pollution standards regulations, or guidelines as appropriate for power plants under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. To achieve this, EPA will engage with stakeholders on program design. This includes states, many of whom have shown great leadership in addressing climate change and energy efficiency, and who will implement the guidelines we set. Power sector leaders, who have taken steps to reduce their own carbon footprint. Labor unions, whose members' jobs and livelihood depend on the electric power sector. Non-governmental organizations such as environmental groups, who have given a lot of thought to how a program could be designed to achieve reductions. Tribal officials that operate power plants and will help us implement guidelines on tribal lands. And members of the public, who have shown a high level of interest in how EPA regulates pollution from power plants. We will seek flexible instruments, tools, and mechanisms when developing the standards, regulations, or guidelines, and tailor actions to cost-effective reductions while maintaining reliability on a range of energy sources. We will also account for other regulatory actions that affect the power sector. This is an important task, and EPA is committed to continue working with states, the power sector, and other stakeholders to achieve these goals. Under the President's directive, EPA will develop carbon requirements for new power plants, modified and reconstructed power plants, and existing power plants. Let's talk a little bit more about what the process will be for each of these. First, standards for new power plants. The President directed EPA to issue a new proposal for these plants by September 20th, 2013. As you may know, the agency issued a proposal for carbon pollution standards for new power plants in April 2012. The new proposal, at the President's direction, will build on that work. We are issuing a new proposal to ensure that carbon pollution standards for new power plants reflect recent developments and trends in the power sector, and also to reflect the input we received from the more than 2.5 million comments that last year's proposal generated. The new proposal will again provide for an open and transparent review through the standard comment period and public hearing process. EPA will then issue a final rule in a timely way after considering all public input. Next, in the President's directive, are standards for modified and reconstructed power plants. Modifications and reconstructions refer to existing sources that undergo major changes, which I'll discuss later in this presentation. The President directed EPA to address pollution from modified and reconstructed power plants by proposing standards by June 1, 2014, and finalizing those standards by June 1, 2015. Third are guidelines for existing power plants. The President directed EPA to address pollution from existing power plants by engaging in a collaborative dialogue with stakeholders and building on state leadership to develop that path forward. This direction includes issuing proposed federal emission guidelines by June 2014 and final guidelines by June 2015. With this program, states will use the federal guidelines as references to develop and submit state plans under Section 111D to EPA by June 2016. The process will build on states' leadership and experience in building greenhouse gas and energy efficiency programs, as well as working with the industry and communities to address this important issue. Over the coming weeks and months, we plan to meet with key groups, speak at upcoming events, post this presentation on EPA's website, and collaborate with other federal agencies. This process will offer a variety of opportunities for comments. We want to make sure we have a chance to hear from you in a number of forums. EPA has been reaching out to states and other stakeholders to better understand what type of engagement would be most useful. This overview presentation is shaped by those discussions. It will provide basic information and a common vocabulary that will help us talk in more depth in discussions in the coming weeks and months. We'll post this presentation on the web as it provides a background on the Clean Air Act and can foster a better understanding of the requirements for power plants under the Act. The next steps will include structured meetings and interactive dialogue with stakeholders. This fall, EPA will host and work with other organizations to set up more detailed meetings that will help inform the rulemaking process. Any proposed guidelines for existing sources will follow the agency's normal, open and transparent regulatory development process, including interagency review and public hearings and public comment periods. So now let's shift to an explanation of the Clean Air Act and how it will inform EPA's work on these rules. In 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that greenhouse gases are to be considered air pollutants that are subject to regulation under the Clean Air Act. Because of this, and the fact that greenhouse gases are not currently regulated under either the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for criteria pollutants or under the National Emission Standards for hazardous air pollutants for air toxics, EPA has the authority to address them under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. This section of the Clean Air Act contains several provisions to address new, modified, reconstructed, and existing sources. Section 111 of the Clean Air Act was authorized by Congress in 1970, and it establishes a mechanism for controlling air pollution from stationary sources, which the administrator, in her judgment, finds, causes, or contributes significantly to air pollution, which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. And EPA has regulated more than 70 source categories and subcategories under Section 111. A full list of the source categories regulated under this section can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations under 40 CFR Part 60. Section 111 lays out different approaches for new and existing sources. Section 111B addresses new, modified, and reconstructed sources by establishing federal standards. Section 111D addresses existing sources by establishing federal guidelines for states to set standards for existing sources. Next, I'll talk about each of these in more depth. EPA sets standards of performance for new sources under Section 111B. These are often called New Source Performance Standards, or NSPS. These standards are to reflect the degree of emission limitation achievable through the application of the Best System of Emission Reduction, or BSER. When determining the best system of emission reduction, EPA is to take into account the costs of achieving emission reductions, non-air quality health and environmental impacts, such as impacts on water quality or ecosystems, and energy requirements. EPA may also distinguish between classes, types, and sizes of sources in setting BSER. For instance, controls for larger sources may not be appropriate for smaller sources, in which case Section 111 would allow EPA to consider setting the BSER based on different sizes of sources. Once EPA establishes standards of performance, each new source must meet those standards. EPA can delegate implementation and enforcement of these standards to the states. In addition, the standards are incorporated into state air permits. These standards are to be reviewed by EPA at least every 8 years and revised if appropriate. For modified and reconstructed sources, EPA also uses Section 111B. Under Section 111B, a modification is defined as a physical or operational change that increases the source's maximum achievable hourly rate of emissions, whereas reconstruction is defined as a single project that replaces components and exceeds 50% of the fixed capital cost that would be required to construct a comparable entirely new facility. In essence, enough of a rebuild that they are a new facility. In establishing standards of performance for modified and reconstructed sources, EPA follows the same process as setting standards for new sources. Each source must meet the standard. These standards are incorporated into state air permits, and they're reviewed by EPA every 8 years and revised if appropriate. Once EPA has elected to set standards of performance under Section 111B for a given source category, Section 111D calls for regulations of existing sources with certain exceptions. Section 111D addresses existing sources that are not regulated under other parts of the Clean Air Act, such as those regulated under the air toxics requirements. Because Section 111D only applies to pollutants not regulated under other parts of the Clean Air Act, it has been used infrequently. EPA has established Section 111D regulations for 5 source categories, including acid mist from sulfuric acid plants, fluorides from phosphate fertilizer and primary aluminum plants, total reduced sulfur from kraft pulp plants, and landfill gases from our landfills. Section 111D uses a different approach for achieving emission reductions than the approach used for new sources under Section 111B. In particular, Section 111D provides that EPA establish a procedure for states to implement performance standards for existing sources. Under Section 111D, EPA does not set explicit emission standards for individual sources. Rather, it develops emission guidelines. While called guidelines, they go through notice and comment and are binding on states. They generally constitute the goal or mark that states have to meet when developing standards of performance for existing sources. Congress anticipated that there may be air pollution problems that EPA would need to address beyond criteria pollutants and air toxics. It also recognized that existing sources do not have as much flexibility as new ones to build emission controls into their design. Therefore, the language in the Clean Air Act for Section 111D is broad. Section 111D provides greater flexibility to EPA and states to design a program in consultation with a diverse range of stakeholders. The state-federal partnership principle of 111D also reflects the state-federal principles woven throughout the Clean Air Act. In this case, EPA generally handles new sources, while states generally handle existing sources in a way that works best for their circumstances. EPA previously has set emission guidelines for 5 source categories. EPA has not prescribed technology that must be used to comply. These past guidelines have shared some common elements. They include the description of BSER that has been adequately demonstrated, the degree of emission limitation achievable, the costs and environmental impacts of application, the time required to implement the guidelines, and other information to facilitate development of state plans, and a goal for reductions or standard of performance based on BSER. Once EPA set the guidelines, states developed Section 111D plans establishing standards of performance for the covered sources in their state. States then submitted Section 111D plans to EPA for review and approval. EPA subsequently evaluated the plans and took action through notice and comment rulemaking. When designing a state plan, states have the flexibility to determine the combination of measures that will meet the federal guideline. State plans set that standard of performance. States must promulgate rules that are consistent or equivalent with the EPA's emission guidelines. These can be identical to EPA's guidelines, or these can differ from, but be equivalent to, EPA's guideline. States may also adopt more stringent standards or shorter compliance schedules than those contained in the guidelines. State plans are also to provide for implementation and enforcement. States have had the flexibility when applying a standard of performance in their plans to take into consideration, among other factors, the remaining useful life of the source. The time frame to submit state plans has been set by EPA in the guideline. In the past, state plans have generally been due within 9 months after publication of the final emission guidelines. In the President's Climate Action Plan, he has instructed this time frame to be 12 months, or by June 30th, 2016. Now that you have a better sense of how 111D has been used in the past, let's talk briefly about this authority and carbon pollution from power plants. In general, carbon pollution emissions differ from pollutants that have been regulated in the past under Section 111D. Carbon pollution is global. It's also an order of magnitude greater than other pollutants covered under Section 111D. And carbon pollution is accumulating and remaining in the atmosphere for over hundreds of years. We have opportunities to explore various program designs and flexibilities because of the broad statutory language of Section 111D, the unique characteristics of carbon pollution, and the interconnected nature of the power sector. To illustrate a few basic concepts about the electric power sector, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Bob Wayland.
Thanks, Lisa, for that introduction. What I'm going to try to do now is take 4 or 5 minutes to walk you through the electric power sector in the United States. The power sector accounted for 33% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States in 2011. In addition, 60% of the U.S. stationary source greenhouse gas emissions in that year could be attributed to the electric power sector. Fossil fuel-fired power plants are the single largest source of CO2 in the United States. When we refer to fossil fuel, we generally are referring to natural gas, petroleum, coal, or any form of solid, liquid, or gaseous fuel derived from those materials which can be used to generate electricity. When we look at the electric power sector, the CO2 emissions can pretty well be divided into 3 major components, the largest of which is coal at roughly 80%, followed by natural gas at about 20%, and then there's somewhere around 1% that can be attributed to petroleum combustion. So as we've seen in this graph, coal is the largest source of CO2 emissions from the power sector in the United States. This map tends to show you two basic things. It shows you how diverse the power sector is in the United States, and it shows you how differing the size of the plants are in the United States. The size of the circle refers to the megawatt capacity of the individual plants, and the color refers to the type of fuel that is being burned there. The purple dots on this slide show where the coal-fired power plants are located, and as you can see, natural gas is indicated by green and the oil plants are indicated by the red dots. There's also a variety of other renewables that are located on this map, as well as the nuclear power plants. As you can see, power plants tend to be concentrated around major urban centers. How is the power sector designed? Well, it basically fits into four very separate components. You have the generation component, which is at the individual power plant where the power is produced. That power is then put out onto a grid system, which is called transmission, and it is carried across the country at very high voltage rates. Then you get into your neighborhoods and your communities, and the power needs to be distributed to the homes, the businesses, and the factories that use this electricity. So in the power sector, we tend to think of generation, transmission, distribution, and then end use. On this particular slide, you get an overview of the electricity transmission grid for the United States as it looked in 2013. Basically, the United States manages transmission of electricity through groups called regional transmission organizations, of which there are roughly 10 in the United States. As you can see from this graph, the transmission pathways across the United States are very complex, and they tend to flow from the power plants to the regional and the urban centers where the power is consumed. This is of great importance to us moving forward because efficiency in transmission will also help reduce the emission of carbon pollution in the United States. At this point, I would like to turn the presentation back over to Lisa Connor, who will take you to the end of this webinar and wrap up today's presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Bob. Many states already have climate and energy policies that reduce carbon pollution from the electric power sector. Their programs show that opportunities for cost-effective reductions may range from direct measures at individual electric generation units to indirect measures that reduce overall electricity demand or increase the use of low or non-emitting generation. To build a Section 111D program that preserves and supports states' leadership, we would like to know more about the state programs that exist today, how they work, the lessons learned from state experience, and what states are planning for the near future. As I've laid out, EPA believes the unique characteristics of carbon pollution and the interconnected nature of the electric power sector call for a broad and flexible approach to designing the program for existing power plants. The President has told us to consider the full range of possibilities as we develop approaches that could accommodate market-based instruments, performance standards, and other regulatory flexibilities. EPA is aware that many different types of approaches and designs are being discussed among stakeholders, ideas for things that might fit under 111D. And the ideas run the gamut from one end of the spectrum to the other and somewhere in between. To help everyone build a common understanding of the range of opportunities for emission reductions, we want to take a moment to define some of these concepts. First, the ideas of a source-based approach and a system-based approach. A source-based approach evaluates emission reduction measures that could be taken directly at the affected sources, in this case, the power plants. A system-based approach evaluates a broader portfolio of measures, including those that could be taken beyond the affected sources, but still reduce emissions at the source. And when we talk about source-based and system-based approaches, there are a few additional terms that we should recognize. First, supply-side options. This term generally refers to actions that occur at the regulated source itself or at other power plants. Second, demand-side option. This term generally refers to actions that occur at locations where electricity is used, as well as transmitted and distributed, not at the regulated source or other power plants. Supply-side options can directly reduce or avoid power plant carbon dioxide emissions through energy efficiency at the source. They can also indirectly reduce or avoid power plant carbon dioxide emissions by increasing the use of low or non-emitting electric generation. Examples may include heat rate improvements or energy efficiency, at the electric generating unit. Fuel switching to a lower emitting fuel or co-firing to a lower emitting fuel. Redispatch of the electric generating unit based on carbon dioxide emission rate or renewable energy portfolio requirements. Demand-side options can indirectly reduce or avoid emissions by lowering electricity demand. These can reduce the overall amount of electricity generated at carbon dioxide emitting power plants. They may also change the dispatch of electric generators in response to lower electricity demand. Examples may include end-use energy efficiency requirements and programs, demand-side management programs, and you may know your own state has many of these programs already in place. Demand-side options address actions that reduce electricity usage by reducing demand and improving the efficiency of energy-using devices. This could include such things as improving insulation and reducing energy losses, reducing wasteful energy use, and replacement of old or inefficient appliances in favor of high-efficiency appliances. Let me say again that these are just some of the basic concepts that EPA is aware of that are being discussed among stakeholders, and these may be ideas that may fit under Section 111D. This conversation is just beginning, and we look forward to continuing these discussions as we work to design a program. As a reminder, the President's directive laid out specific timelines that EPA is working to meet. EPA will issue proposed carbon pollution standards, regulations, or guidelines as appropriate for modified, reconstructed, and existing power plants by no later than June 1, 2014. EPA will issue these final standards, regulations, or guidelines as appropriate by no later than June 1, 2015. With these guidelines, there will be a requirement for states to submit their plans to EPA by no later than June 30th, 2016. This webinar is the beginning of our stakeholder outreach process. A link to this webinar will be on EPA's YouTube channel at the following URL, posted by August 28, 2013. We will then offer 4 follow-up conference calls about the overview presentation in early September. Calls for state, local, and tribal agencies and for the public, including community groups, will be on September 9th. Calls for industrial and environmental stakeholders will be on September 12th. More information will be available soon on those calls. We will provide information on these upcoming calls at the website shown here. In closing, we want to thank you again for joining us for this overview presentation. Building this common language is an important first step in EPA's effort to engage directly with our stakeholders on issues informing the design of the program to address carbon pollution from existing power plants. Thank you.